length of time spent abroad. There are deeper cultural and societal connotations that affect how these terms are used and perceived. I have so many friends and stories on both sides of the fence, experiences of people who have moved here and how different individuals approach that experience. Some are over here and they really have a lot of difficulty making it in Italy. And then I know so many people on the other side of the fence. So now I have this kind of whole Italian essence in my being. So when I go back to the United States, I really gravitate to Italian Americans, and I love to hear their stories and how they got there and hear about their relatives and their grandparents and just the journey of their Italian immigrant experience. Basically, from the early days of America, immigrants from the Italian peninsula played a small but notable role in shaping the United States. Italian craftsmen were known worldwide for their different kinds of skills, and many made the journey to the United States, leaving their mark as sculptors or woodworkers and glassblowers. Thomas Jefferson was a well-known fan of Italian culture, and he brought in Italian stonemasons to work on his Monticello estate and musicians from Italy to help form the core of the Marine Band. And he even invented a hand crank pasta machine. And if you go to the Library of Congress or have a look in the Library of Congress, his design is still there. In fact, just to speak about the Library of Congress, if you're ever looking for historical information, it's a fantastic library, and you can find so much of their information online these days. And I'll put a link to the Library of Congress in the show notes. And I'll also include a lot of the Italian immigrant photos that I found on the Library of Congress website. So Italian immigration in the early 19th century wasn't overwhelming, but the few who did arrive in that period made a really significant impact. So between 1820 and 1870, less than 25,000 Italians came to America, and mainly from the north. And they tended to spread out across the country, from New Jersey's farming communities to the vineyards of California and the port in San Francisco and New Orleans. And their influence can still be seen today in many areas. So let's take Lorenzo da Ponte, for instance. He founded the first opera house in the United States, and he almost single-handedly introduced Italian opera to American audiences. And the abolitionist movement was supported by Sabato Morais, a rabbi from Tuscany, and he brought with him a fierce commitment to freedom and human rights. And then let's think about Constantino Brumidi. And he was the painter who spent decades decorating the U.S. Capitol with his gorgeous frescoes, including the Grand Dome. Now, the really big wave of Italian immigrants was in the 1880s, when about 300,000 Italians came to America. And by the 1890s, that number had doubled. And during the first decade of the 20th century, more than 2 million Italians arrived to the United States. So by 1920, the total number of Italian immigrants in the U.S. topped 4 million, which made up about 10% of the country's foreign-born population. So why did so many of these Italians who immigrated to the States decide to leave? Well, it's pretty complex and a lot of different reasons, but it really boiled down to a matter of survival. So by the late 1800s, Italy was finally united under one flag, but the country was still far from being what we would call stable. I mean, there were many years of social upheaval and poverty and natural disasters, earthquakes that had been left to the south, especially in the rural areas. And Sicily was particularly impoverished and struggling. Think of disease, famine, the political unrest, and it just made life unbearable. And these Sicilians and these Italians in these poor areas, they felt they really had very little hope of improving their situation. And then they started to hear back, stories from the United States about American prosperity through these immigrants who returned. And then they started to look towards America for a better life. And they just considered that America offered them a possibility of hope and opportunity and a fresh start. But this new wave of immigrants, it was different from those who came before. So gone were the days when most immigrants were northern Italian artisans or shopkeepers. And instead, the vast majority now were farmers and laborers, and many of them single men looking for work. And lots of them really didn't have any intention of staying. I would say about 30 to 50% of them did end up returning to Italy after a few years. And they were known as the ritornati, the ones who returned. But even those who returned made a contribution to Italy's economy. It's estimated that they sent or took home millions of dollars annually that boosted the wealth of certain regions back in Italy. And let's now think about, as we always do, Ellis Island, that's so closely associated with our vision of immigration and how Italians and other nationalities came into the United States. So for most Italian immigrants, the journey to America really did begin at Ellis Island. Before Ellis Island, New York's immigration processing station was the notorious Castle Garden, which was well known for its corruption and thievery. So Ellis Island, instead, built in the New York harbor, was intended to be a safer, more controlled space for processing the massive influx of immigrants. It opened up in 1892, and it became the first stop for millions of immigrants entering the U.S., with up to 5,000 people passing through on a single day. I mean, almost an unimaginable number, particularly for the time. Now, these weren't only Italians, they were a multitude of nationalities, but lots of Italians. So, as I say, for many Italian families, their American story began here. While Ellis Island represented the promise of a new life, the reality of the process was often absolutely harsh. So the new arrivals, they were numbered, they were sorted and inspected for physical and mental fitness. For example, a failed eye exam or the impression that someone was too weak for manual labor could mean that you're deported then and there. So families were so afraid to be torn apart, and some of the members were allowed to stay and others were sent back. And this fear of separation earned Ellis Island the nickname L'Isola delle Lacrime, or the Island of Tears. So even for those who passed inspection, the experience could be overwhelming. For them, and most of them didn't speak English, of course. I mean, the regulations were confusing, the crowds were overwhelming, and the constant noise of these dozens of languages being spoken added to the confusion. But then, once the final inspection was complete and immigrants boarded ferries for New York or some other further away destination, there was this great sense of relief. But that journey was really just the beginning. So then you get into the settling in phase and the creation for example, in particular in New York, of Italian neighborhoods. Many Italian immigrants, they decided